Welcome back, guys, to Casual U. Because I say Casual Yu-Gi-Oh, the old name of the channel, Casual Commander. So today I'm going to be showcasing my Numot the Devastator EDH Commander deck. I have a little nickname for it. Normally I find these nicknames lame, but I thought mine was kind of clever. I called it Taxation without land representation. So the whole point of this deck. So I guess I should go back to it. A few years ago, I tried to build this deck, and I tried to run a lot of the 4-drop red sorceries that were like blow up one target land or whatever. And I found out that that rate is not good enough, especially in a commander game. In 1v1, you'd probably be okay, but in a commander game, that's not good enough. There are other cards that say, like, basically everybody sacks land that I probably could be running. By the way, with all my deck profiles, I'm open to suggestions. I mean, I only ask that people try to understand when I say I don't run something. It's like, if you show me a card, there's a high chance that I've already seen it, and there's probably a reason I'm not running it, and it might not be from a gameplay reason. It might just be because I don't like the card and I want to have fun. But fun is subjective. But I'm open to suggestions. Like, I just uploaded my dinosaur deck profile. That's a deck out of all my decks that I'm like, I feel like I know that like the back of my hand. But if someone's got a good suggestion, I will always take it, and then I'll try to give you credit for it, or I'll highlight it or respond, be like, dude, thank you so much. So anyway, I tried to run this deck a few years ago, ran into problems, and then I rebuilt it when I first got back into Magic. When I say got back in, I was still keeping up with it, but a couple months ago when I was like, I'm going to rebuild my decks, this was one of the first ones that came to mind because of the way I built it, how cheap the deck was. So anyway, land base, typical for me, 13 basics of each type because I'm running a 3-color deck. I will say, like I said, if someone else wants to build this deck, we are running like close to 60 blue pips. So you obviously, if you were making your own deck, you could switch the land number up, and you could be like, I'm running 20 something islands. That's your choice if you want to do that. We do need some red because of Numot's ability, and then we also need some white because of some other things. By the way, if someone is new to this and doesn't know what Numot does, he's a 6/6 flying dragon. Whenever he deals combat damage to a player, you can pay a red and 2 generic, and if you do, destroy up to 2 target lands. That is an effect on the surface that you can only do once. You can't, if you leave all your mana open, you have like, let's say like 6 mana, you can't use that effect twice. You can only do it once. Now there are cards to duplicate it. I don't even know if I'm running those. I'm not even running extra combat stuff, so that's stuff that you could do, but the way this deck is built, Numot would be the only one that's getting use out of that, and I kind of built the deck in a different way. Okay, a lot of people start with creatures. We run something else more than we run creatures, so I always try to start with whatever I run the most of the deck. And that would be instants. This is a counter spell tribal deck. So we're going to start with the low drop. So 1 drop, Annual, counter target artifact or enchantment spell. A lot of people run artifacts or enchantments. I like it. Dispel, counter target instant spell. A lot of people like to run instants against me, but in general, helps you from getting counterspelled. A lot of people, the narrative that's been pushed in Commander, I would say in the last couple of years, is that if something, they're like, oh, that's a sorcery, that's too slow, don't run that. So because of, I don't want to call them tryhards, but just because of people pushing that narrative, this counters so many more things than it used to. So I think you'd be surprised, but so many people run instants for everything because they're afraid of sorcery. So that works to our advantage. Another card that can counter instant, but other stuff. Swan Song. You give someone a 2/2 bird, but in exchange you get to counter an enchantment, instant, or sorcery. This hits so many things. Yeah, it doesn't hit artifacts or creatures and planeswalkers, I guess, but hits mostly good stuff. And for one, that's really good rate. Okay, now we're into the 2 drops. Got Counterspell. I know this card, people are kind of down on it because I guess they're like, whoa, it's hard to hit 2 blue pips. It's really not. Being able to counter anything, that's still great. And this is a great value card. That's another thing with this deck. I mean, aside from like Swan Song, this deck's mostly budget, where most of these counters are going to be fairly cheap. New one from Brothers War, Defabricate. I really like this one. Counter target artifact or enchantment spell. If the spell's countered this way, it gets exiled. And then you could also, as a choice, you could choose to counter target activated or triggered ability. I've only done that once. It was basically because I had no choice. My opponent knew that I had a counter, and they were kind of playing. They were kind of playing against it, and I basically got into a corner where I had to use the counter target. The problem with it, like in Yu-Gi-Oh, if you were to counter something like that, it would be like, oh, negate and then destroy. This is basically just negate. There's not many cards that do that, but Anyway, Disdainful Stroke. This is a great one. Counter target spell converted mana cost 4 or greater. We're in Commander, so a lot of people are playing stuff like that. Most people's Commanders are that, at least. So, great card. Because we run white, we can run Dovin's Veto. This spell can't be countered. Counter target non-creature spell. I don't know. You never know when this actually comes in handy in the fact of if someone did have a counter spell, they're not going to let you know about it. So, but it's nice. I mean, it's a good card. Essence Scatter, counter target creature spell. By the way, I just want to point out, a lot of people will say these cards aren't good. In my opinion, the budget stuff, anything 2 mana or less, even if it's situational, if it can counter something that most people are playing, I would run it. I think the stuff you got to be wary of is, more expensive CMC stuff. Memory Lapse. Counter target spell. If the spell's countered this way, put it on the top of its owner's library instead of putting it in the graveyard. Okay, so some people are like, this card's not very good. You're on a budget. That's one thing. So this card's cheap. Second of all, this card costs next to nothing to cast. And third, that card, unless they're going to draw, that card is going to be sealed away for a turn, basically. Yeah, they can draw it next turn, but the cool thing about that is that if your opponent was counting on drawing, let's say they needed a land drop, or let's say they were like, I have land and I don't have anything to play, you can at least be like, all right, I'm setting you back a turn. And that gives me another turn to reload and have another counterspell. I'm cool with it. Some people think it sucks. I like it. Negate, great card. Counter target non-creature spell. That's great. Here's an underrated one. Neutralizing Blast. Counter target multicolored spell. Because we're in Commander, I would say more than 9 times out of 10. I don't know what number you'd put it at, but I don't run into many monocolored decks. I mean, there's a few, but most people are at least playing more than one color because it's more fun to play more than one color. Remand, I like this one. Counter target spell, if it's countered this way, put it into his owner's hand instead of its owner's graveyard, but I get to draw a card. So basically, like, yes, there's the risk of if I counter something that's too low of a CMC, they'll be able to play it again, but you try not to do that. You try to counter something that you know they don't have the mana to play it back this turn, and then you're like, okay, counter that, you'll have to try to play that again next turn, and I get to draw a card out of this. It's a win for me, I feel like. Another underrated one, the last 2 drops, Second Guess. Counter target spell, that's the second spell cast this turn. I don't know, maybe people read this and they think that's not going to happen very often. It happens quite a lot, actually. A lot of times people, they do a setup where they're like, okay, I play this first card, and this card now will give me advantage for when I play this next card. And the second card is normally the thing that you'd want to counter anyway, and Second Guess really does a good job of that. Or you can really screw with people if one player is countering something, or one player is playing something, and then another player wants to counter it. You can step in and be like, okay, I'm going to save your ass. What are you going to give me in return? And you can counter it with Second Guess. Because basically, when you're offering them the deal, you can say, hey, if I stop that and I protect you, what do I get out of it? And they'll do a little handshake agreement, and they'll be like, I'll give you immunity for this, or I'll do that. And then you can be like, okay, cool. And they didn't know the whole time that your counterspell was so situational that you could only counter that at that instance. This deck is actually very political. I would say in a good way. It does politics in a good way. A lot of times, I will be having people come to me for deals and be like, please don't counter this. And I'll be like, okay, fine, I won't, but what do I get out of it? And I won't have a counter spell to play. So that's another cool thing. Don't get me wrong, when this deck is really humming, people hate it and they'll team up against you. But this deck's hit or miss. I mean, I'll be honest, like, right now, it's not functioning at the most high level, and you could say it's because of the way I do the lands. But like I said, you guys can build this deck however you want. Take knowledge that you like from it, and then build it however you want. Just don't call me some dumbass in the comment section. Just be like, okay, he wants to build his decks that way. I'll just make it better, and go do it. All right, 3 drops. Ionize. I love the artwork of this card. It's so cool. Because we play the medallions, I love having that red pip, so it's another card. Like, I could use the red medallion or the blue medallion to reduce this spell's cost. But anyway, it says counter target spell, and then this thing deals 2 damage to that spell's controller. Just a little bit extra damage, but the 3-drop instance that counter anything, I've tried to reduce the amount that I'm playing, and I just try to keep it more situational, or I want the payoff to be good. For this one, it's because it's multicolored, and because, like I said, one of 2 medallions could reduce the cost. The only counterspell in white that I feel is worth playing, it's Lapse of Certainty. Counter target spell, if that spell is countered this way, put it on top of its owner's library instead of that player's graveyard. Kind of like that Memory Lapse card, except it costs 1 more. but it's in white. And so that's the cool thing with memory lapse of certainty is you can tap your blue, do your turn or whatever, and then people be like, okay, I'm in the clear, like I'm good. And then you leave the white open, they don't think anything of it, and then you counter it. I mean, lapse of certainty is a very, very cool card. Okay, we got render silent, counter target spells, controller can't cast spells this turn. It was really unfortunate. The last time I tried to play this, someone actually did have a counter to my render silent, and I was like, damn, and then they went off, and I was like, my render silent could have gone through, I would have been just fine. The last 3 drop, one of the best ones, Unwind, counter target non-creature spell, untap up to 3 lands. Some decks, you know, this card doesn't get a whole lot of run because they don't have a whole lot to do in their opponent's turns, but with our deck, we're perfectly fine with that. We normally have plenty to do, and we're normally untapping mostly blue. Okay, 4 drops. This is one I found recently. I'm sure most people don't think this is that good, but I like it. Counter target spell, its controller discards a card. So for 4 mana, which you'll see in a second, we have plenty of ways of reducing this thing's generic mana cost. The ability to counter something and then be like, also you're going down another card. I like, for the price of 1 card from my hand to get rid of basically 2 things of theirs, I like that value. Okay. Reinterpret, counter target spell. This is one of my favorite counters. You may cast a spell with equal or lesser mana value from your hand without paying its mana cost. Okay, so this is good and bad in this deck. So the good is obviously you counter something, and then you're like, okay, I just countered the biggest thing I thought I could wait. Let's say it was a 5-drop. There's some decent 5-drop or lower stuff that you could bring back out in this deck. The problem is a lot of this deck is instant, so the timing wouldn't be right if you were like, I'll cast a counter spell. That just wouldn't work. So there's some stuff you can bring out. You'll see in a second. So this card, like I said, sometimes we don't have the right thing to cheat out, so it kind of doesn't make it worth it. But I wish Wizards would make more cards like this, because this is great design for a counter spell. Rewind, great one. Counter target spell, untap up to 4 lands. Love that. Okay, so the last 2 counters, they're both 6 drops. Counter Lash, you counter target spell, and then you may cast a non-land card in your hand that shares a card type with that spell without paying its mana cost. So we're mainly looking for like creature spells for this one because we have some creatures that are really worth it if we could cheat them out for free. Okay, last counter spell, last instant is Overwhelming Intellect. I love the flavor text of this one. My brain hurts. It gets a laugh normally at my playgroup. Counter target creature spell, draw cards equal that spell's converted mana cost. So the reason I like this is because if you get to counter a creature spell for, let's say, like 2 mana, you're like, that's not a bad rate. So if you can counter something, view it this way, if you can counter a creature spell that's 4 mana value or higher, which I would say most commanders are, if you can do that, you're like, cool, counter that thing, set them back, and then I get to draw, let's say, 4 cards. That's pretty good. And I know that this costs you 6 mana, but we have ways to reduce it, and it has a high ceiling. That's what I like about it. If, God forbid, you're able to hold up mana and they try to play some big creature, you're like, cool, and you can just restock your hand. I've had this happen a few times where I think I countered a 6-drop creature, and I was like, sweet, and I get to just restock my hand. Loved it. All right, on to the creatures. We run 22 instants, I believe, and 21 creatures, so they're kind of split. But Baral, Chief of Compliance, he's one of the best cards in the deck, reducing instant sorcery spells by 1. And then obviously, whenever a spell or ability you control counters a spell, you get to draw a card and then discard a card. I like that. I wish he cost a little bit more in the CMC, and I wish he just said whenever you counter a spell, draw a card. That would have been nice, but maybe they thought that would be too busted. Okay, so that's it for that. Goblin Electromancer. Instant sorcery spells cost 1 less to cast. It's not as good as Baral, but it's still a great card. A card that I never see people run, but I love it. It's one of my favorite cards in the deck. Sprite Dragon. 1/1 Flying Haste Fairy Dragon. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put a +1/+1 on it. This thing gets big and a problem fast, and people they're also not prepared for that turn 2. Oh, this thing has Flying Haste, I'm gonna attack right away. So I really like that one. New card out of Brothers War. Third Path Iconoclast. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, make a 1/1 colorless soldier artifact creature token. I like this because we don't actually make a big board normally with creatures where our opponents, they have opportunities to get in with damage or whatever. So this card allows us to counter stuff and then slowly build up like an army to block against our opponent's creatures. One of my favorite cards in the deck, Fate Spinner. This is a card, I'm sure people were running this in stall and stacks decks, and control decks before, but I didn't know this card existed until a few years ago. When I found it, I felt really smart. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, that player chooses draw step, main, or combat phase The player skips each instant of the chosen step or phase this turn. So it doesn't affect us, which that in general, I don't like playing cards that could hinder us. So this card only affects our opponents. Normally, I would say people pick combat because it's like the thing that in their head, they're like, I can kind of get away with not attacking this turn. And then I have a buddy, Brendan, sometimes he'll just skip the draw because he's already got draw power on board. And that's the kind of unfortunate thing is you're like, damn, because you kind of hope that they're always, you'd hope people skip main phase, obviously, but they never do because obviously they want to play. All right, Gutter Snipe, great card in here. When you cast instant sorcery, deal 2 damage to each opponent. That's great, and in my opinion, if we can at least get to like doing this 3 times, then I'm like, this card paid for itself. Where I'm like 6 damage for 3 mana, I'm like, I'll take it to each opponent. All right, cool card in a counter deck, Lil Mage Mentor. He's a 2/2. Whenever a spell or ability you control counters a spell, put a 1/1 blue Merfolk onto the battlefield, and then you can tap 7 untap Merfolk, counter target spell. I've never gotten this off, or maybe I have once, but I've always dreamed. I'm like, if I can just get this guy out and then counter some stuff like I normally do, I'm like, once you get 7 out, I'm like, you're pretty much rolling, because that's a free counter spell that you're doing when you tap. Excuse me. There's counters you can run with him, or combos, I should say, but I'm not doing them at the moment because I feel like I would need more synergy in the deck. Grand Arbiter, a card that everybody hates that's your opponent, but you love it. I've always loved this guy because I like stacks and I like spell reduction for my stuff, and this does both. Loxodon Gatekeeper, artifacts, creatures, and lands your opponent's control come into play tapped. Love that. New one that I put in here, Magus of the Tabernacle. All creatures, it's a 2/6 for 4 mana, which that's good stats. All creatures have at the beginning of your upkeep, sack this creature unless you pay 1. So I said I don't like playing things that can hinder us. This one can, but I'm normally okay with it because the way I view it, I'm not trying to get a ton of creatures out there, and my opponents, that's how they're going to have to win to beat me, is have a bunch of creatures to try to like kill me fast. So this way, I'm like, I'm already taxing you for everything else. And I'm like, now I'm making you pay 1 to keep every single one of your creatures. And in a token deck, that's just not plausible. So I love this card. Pyroceratops, basically another version of that Sprite Dragon, just slightly different. 4 mana, it's a 2/3 with trample. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put a ++1 on this. I like this card a lot. Talrand. There's a few cards that say when you cast like an instant sorcery or a non-creature spell, do something. Some of them say make tokens. This is the best one that I found because you get a 2/2 flying Drake. I think that's cool every time you cast an sorcery. Granted, it doesn't work with artifacts or enchantments, but that's okay. Windborn Muse. It's like a propaganda or a ghostly prison, but just on a creature. I love that. Spell Tithe Enforcer. Whenever an opponent plays a spell, the player sacrifices a permanent unless he or she pays 1. Most people try to pay the 1, and then after a while they realize like, okay, I'm not going to be able to keep up, so they are forced to start sacrificing permanents. Obviously, if they have stuff like treasures or whatever, they won't care, but I love this card, Voracious Great Shark. I just love the artwork, love the concept. For 5 mana, he has Flash. When it enters the battlefield, counter target artifact or creature spell. Anything that lets you put a body on the board while you counter is really good, in my opinion. At least, especially for this deck. A new card that I found, World Queller. I didn't realize this card existed. It's a 4/4 for 5. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may choose a card type. If you do, each player sacrifices a permanent of that type. So I'll let you know now. I don't run Planeswalkers. Not saying that would come up very often, but if I ran against somebody that ran Planeswalkers, I'm like, bro, this is cool, because every turn, you're just going to have to sacrifice one. We don't run many artifacts, like almost at all. So artifacts probably the thing I pick. Obviously, I want lands to go away because it's Numot, but in general, I'm not really looking to lose my lands if I can avoid it. Now, if I feel like it's worth it, where I start attacking with Numot and I feel like I can get some advantage, okay. But it just depends on where the game's at. I might choose enchantment if I don't really have any enchantments that I care about out. I mean, we don't run that many enchantments, so those are good options. A card that I like in red, Charmbreaker Devils. It's not the greatest card. This card's fairly cheap, and people think like, oh, 6 mana, that's ridiculous. But in a deck like this, where you're stalling people out and you can counter their removal and things like that, you can actually kind of protect this guy. So at the beginning of your upkeep, you grab an instant or sorcery from your graveyard at random back to your hand. To me, it doesn't matter which one I'm grabbing. They all kind of do the same thing, so I'm good with that. And then whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, this thing gets +4/+0 until end of turn. I mean, in a traditional Spellslinger deck, you can make this guy big and then swing with him. In this deck, it's more like, do you really want to attack me if I can just counter 2 things a turn and then get this guy up to being a 12/4? Like, you're going to lose whatever you come at me with. A A card I didn't know existed, I know that's probably shameful, but Draining Welk. I think this guy's really cool. 1/1 flash flying, whenever he enters the battlefield, counter target spell, and then you get put X +1/+1 counters on this thing where X is that spell's converted mana cost, so obviously we want the bigger the better. Guile, cool card. 6 mana, 6/6, can't be blocked except by 3 or more creatures. If a spell or ability I control would counter a spell, instead exile that spell, and I can play it without paying its mana cost. That is amazing in this deck. Also, a little known fact, he has that other part of his text. Whenever he's put into a graveyard from anywhere, shuffle him in his owner's library. That means anywhere, so milled included. So sometimes I've forgotten that in the past where I'm like, oh crap, I forgot about that effect. If you have to discard him, yeah, or if he's milled, you gotta shuffle him back in. Those are the rules. Tectonic Hellion. So in a deck strategy where we're trying to get rid of other people's lands, we don't run green, so most of the time other people are gonna have more lands than us. So when this thing attacks, it's an 8/5 with haste. Each player who controls the most lands sacrifices 2 lands. Normally that won't be us until our strategy starts to get going. So the first time you try to do that, you should be fine. One of my favorite cards, Tidespout Tyrant. Whenever you cast a spell, return target permanent to its owner's hand. So this thing costs 8, and I know what you're thinking, which is like, that's a lot of mana. It is. And that effect is only bouncing something back to the hand, but it says permanent. So we can choose lands as well. We have a lot of low CMC cards with our instants, so that's good. And then we have a few ways to cheat this guy out. Like I showed you those instants before. We have someone was calling me, sorry. So we have, like I said, those 2 instants, Reinterpret and what was the other one? Counterlash. 2 ways that we could possibly cheat this guy out. So that's cool. All right, now to the enchantments. I think we run, I thought it was 11, but we'll check. Counterbalance. This is a fairly expensive one. I think it's around 20 bucks. So it's 2 blue. Whenever an opponent plays a spell, you may reveal the top card of your library. If you do, counter that spell if it has the same CMC as the revealed card. Okay, I understand this card isn't likely to counter something, and I get that. But for 2 blue mana, it raises like the threat of your stuff could be countered. And I have a few cards that get advantages off stuff getting countered. So I like it. And for 2 blue, like I said, that's not a whole lot. And I can just sit it out there and be like, okay. And I may get lucky. Also, if my opponent casts something and they didn't pay any mana to cast the spell, I think that's how that works. If they cast something for 0, well, I guess no, maybe that wouldn't work because it says the CMC of the card. So maybe that wouldn't work. I was thinking like if you had a land on the top of your deck. Okay. Love this card, As Foretold. So this is one of the... As Foretold is a really cool blue card in general, but in this deck you can really get use out of it. At the beginning of your upkeep, put a time counter on it, and then you can cast once each turn. You may pay 0 rather than pay the mana cost of a spell, as long as its mana value is less than the number of time counters you control. So basically, if this card's been on the board for 1 turn, you'll have 1 time counter on it, which means anything that is 1 CMC or less, you can just cast for free. But you can only cast once each turn. But the key phrase is not once only during your turn, it's each turn. So in a deck that runs a lot of instants, or a deck that runs a bunch of flash stuff, you can just basically be like, okay, cool. I'll play 1 drop for free, and then on your turn I'll counter something, and on your turn I'll counter something. Obviously, for the most part, we're not even cheating a whole lot of stuff out on our turn until this thing gets up to like 3. But in a control deck, it's very plausible that you could protect this thing and get the time counters up. Aura of Silence. Generally, we're not going to sack it to pop anything. We're just going to keep this out there to tax our opponent's artifacts and enchantments. Back to basics. I've warned you guys in the past, don't come around be like, oh man, you suck because you only run basics, and then I play this against you. Don't be crying to me. Because like this is just the penalty you pay for running non-basics. Like I said, if you want to do that because you feel like you're helping out your deck, okay, but don't cry to me whenever I say, hey, all those that you just tapped out for, they're just going to sit there and be useless. Ghostly Prison, and I'll just put this out right now. Propaganda, same card, basically. I said I normally don't like doing that, running the same version of a card. I make an exception for Ghostly Prison and Propaganda because they're in different colors, and I love Pillow Fort, so I don't care. A really good one in this strategy, Rule of Law. Each player can't cast more than 1 spell each turn. So, I mean, in a control deck like this, my opponents get to play 1 thing a turn. I get to counter that 1 thing every turn, and then we're good. And then basically I can just nullify my opponents altogether. Dissipation Field, great one for this deck. Whenever a permanent deals damage to me, return to his owner's hand. That includes you, so if you have a card that deals damage to yourself, that thing will have to get bounced. But in general, I don't think we do anything like that. But yeah, affects our opponents because they're like, crap, it costs so much for my stuff to get cast out anyway. And if I try to swing at you, and like it shuts down weenie decks basically because they're like, okay, well they'll just get bounced and they'll lose. Great card. I love Dissipation Field. Whirlwind of Thought. This is a Jeskai staple for me, no matter what I'm running. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, draw a card. Love that. My favorite red card, Sunbird's Invocation. Whenever you cast a spell from your hand or the top X cards, where X that spell's converted mana cost, then you can cast something for free of those cards without paying its mana cost, as long as the CMC is less than or equal to whatever you cast in the first place. Love Sunbird's Invocation. So it contradicts with the Rule of Law, because if you have Rule of Law and you have Sunbirds, Sunbirds won't be able to ever cast another card because of Rule of Law. But aside from that, we're good. So I will say this, like in this deck, because you run so many instants, there's a chance that like you'll do Sunbird's Invocation and you won't get anything that you can cast. But we also run a decent amount, like what did I say, 20, I think I said like 21 creatures. There's like 11 enchantments. We have like 5 artifacts. So I feel like we got a decent amount of stuff that we could hit besides just an instant. So I love that. Okay, and then like I said, lastly, well, I guess we got a few sorceries, but we got 5 artifacts. So you know me, I run the medallions. If we get any one of these on like, you know, earlier turns, means we get to cheat out Numot a little bit sooner. So I love that. Next we got Smokestack. You could argue that this deck, you know, this card could be thrown in a lot of decks, but in this deck, I love it. Give your upkeep, put a soot counter on Smokestack. So for the first turn, it's not going to do anything. It's just going to sit out there. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player sacrifices a permanent for each soot counter on Smokestack. So basically, once it gets back to your turn the first time, it's going to get a soot counter, and then you have to sacrifice a permanent. Okay, that sucks, I guess. But in a deck like this, it's going to start hurting our opponents a lot more than it's going to hurt us, because we're not the ones getting taxed. They're getting taxed. So they may at first be like, I'm cool with sacking a creature. Eventually they're going to be like, I might have to start sacking lands. And once they start sacking lands, it's pretty much game over. But they feel like they have no choice because they can't just sit there with lands and no creatures. Otherwise, they'll lose anyway. So love that. Last artifact, God Pharaoh Statue. Spells your opponent's cast cost 2 more to cast. This card's great. Yes, it costs 6. But in a deck like this, that's okay because of that effect. And then that tiny little effect of at the beginning of each of your end steps, each opponent loses 1 life. I don't really know why they added that in there. I'd run this card even without that effect, but I won't complain. Okay, and then lastly, we have 2 sorceries. Mitotic Manipulation. This is probably, it might be my favorite blue card that I run in a lot of my blue decks. So for 3 mana, you look at the top 7 cards of your library. You may put one of those cards on the battlefield if it has the same name as a permanent. So that means including your opponents, what they have. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. People say that blue doesn't have any ramp. This is blue ramp. And I mean land ramp, not like I tap and I get this many colored mana, whatever. No, this can get a land. So if, let's say I'm playing a commander game and I have an opponent that has, and I have to have islands already to be able to play this, but let's say I don't have mountains or plains, but I have 3 opponents and one of each is playing red and white. Then I can be like, Mitotic Manipulation, look at the top 7. I've never played this where I didn't get a land out of any of the top 7. But for 3 mana to be able to ramp a land and it comes in untapped, I think that's pretty good, and nobody plays this, and I think they should. And then lastly, last card in the deck is Ruination. Destroy all non-basic lands. I told you, don't screw with me. Don't screw with me. All right, that's it for the deck profile, right under 30 minutes. Hope you guys enjoyed. Numot, when I was first trying to pick commanders, people complain about land destruction, but for me, it's one of the things that intrigues me about Magic is you have lands that are resources that could be blown up, hypothetically. So I think people need to stop complaining about it. Here's what I don't understand. Why are infinites and extra turn spells and making copies a zillion times and having infinite mana, that's all deemed like that's fine, that's acceptable. But a second you're like, I want to blow up somebody else's lands, you're like, dude, that you just don't do that. That's uncalled for. And I'm like, I don't understand where the lineage, where that comes from, because for me, this doesn't win all that often. It's fun, and when it does win, you're like, you feel really good about yourself because you're like, yeah, I shut them down. But your opponents, like I said, I have a buddy that runs nothing but like infinites and combos in all his decks, and I'm like, he'll complain about this when his lands are getting blown up, and I'm like, but it's okay for you to just do Infinite City. Anyway, I should stop giving him a hard time because I do love him and I don't want him to not be my friend anymore. But it's just frustrating when your Magic ideologies disagree with each other. But anyway, that's it for the deck, right under 30 minutes. I hope you guys enjoyed. I'll be back to give you more deck profiles. This is Casual Commander. Have a good one.